language that we can understand. Some of them have languages that we can't, written language that we can't understand. We'll talk about this later in our unit. But broadly, just some of the topics or some of the methods we're going to be using today in how we understand Andean and Chavin art is we're going to look at archaeology. We'll look at ethnographic analogy. Ethnographic analogy is when you make an analogy, a comparison between two cultures. So usually we're comparing a culture that we don't know a lot about to a culture that we know more about. And so when we're in the Andes, often the culture we know the most about is the Inca culture. And the Inca might be a culture that you've heard of before or maybe had some small units, even in elementary, middle, or high school. They tend to be the kind of most famous empire. They were the last empire in the Andes. They weren't the only empire in the Andes. So we often use what we know about the Inca to help us understand earlier cultures. Now let's just be clear. The Incas were an empire in the 1530s. That's like during the Italian Renaissance, okay? Some of the cultures that we're looking at today are from 2,000 years earlier or more, 3,000 years earlier. So how similar are they? I don't know. How similar will cultures in 3,000 years be to us? Probably not very, right? So I always say ethnographic analogy is a methodology that we want to be very careful with. And I'm going to point out an example that will hopefully give you pretty clear as to why it can be a little bit damning or it can be kind of a dangerous methodology to use. For example, linguistics. The Inca language, the language of the Inca Empire was Quechua. Okay? It is still a living language. There are over 1 million speakers. If you were really interested in learning more about the Inca and you wanted to learn to speak an indigenous language, there are several language acquisition programs you can sign up for in Cusco or in Bolivia. And you can learn and go to speak Quechua today. But we don't think that the people of Chavin were actually speaking Quechua. So how relevant is it to use kind of concepts that are in Quechua in order to understand a culture that didn't speak it, right? So that's just kind of an example. But linguistics are often a methodology that we use, the study of language. Concepts that are in language often are useful to understand culture. And so that's something that we will often kind of look at. We're also going to use the methodology of phenomenology. That's typically when we're using architecture. That's something that I'd like to bring in. This idea of the way in which the architectural space interacts with the scale of our own body, right? And you can think about this even just in a simple sense of if you're outside a really large structure, it can sometimes make you feel a little bit small, right? Versus if you're walking into like a kid's playhouse. If anyone's walked into like a kid's playhouse recently, like you feel like a giant. You have to like bend over to the door and you can't stand all the way up and things like that. That is the way that the space is interacting with your body. That's a phenomenological method of understanding the way the space is being organized. We're also going to look at some environmental factors. So this methodology can employ any number of geology, understanding the formation of rocks, understanding the landscape, understanding the animals, the plants that are in those areas. So there are any number of kind of scientific disciplines that we often incorporate, and you can often see that we often use mixed methods, right? So sometimes our archaeology will tell us that a certain plant was there in the archaeological record, and so then we can learn more about that plant to see how it was being used in a culture at a certain time. So you might be using multiple methods. So we're going to be focused on these methods as we look at our material, not just today, but really throughout the semester. It's really important to understand the environment we're going to be looking at. Has anyone been to the Andes, to Peru or Bolivia, Chile? Anyone? Oh, good. We got it's like a whole new experience for us. Has anyone been to California, the Pacific Coast? I guess I've been to. Okay, so you have that experience if you've been to California. If you haven't and you're lucky enough to get out there, it is beautiful. But you've had the experience if you've been to California, which is also on the Pacific Coast, of kind of standing, if you've been at the coast at least, seeing the ocean and mountains at the same time. And that's what a lot of the coastline looks like on the Pacific coast of South America. Right? So we're going to be looking a lot at this area of Ecuador down through Peru. We're not really going to get into Chile or Colombia, although we certainly could. There are many cultures that are there simultaneously. of the Pacific Ocean, the coast, a very short coastal area, and then we get 2 mountain ranges. And these 2 mountain ranges then are immediately abutted with the tropical forest. Has anyone been to Brazil or a rainforest in Brazil? It's the same rainforest that abuts these mountains, right? So that rainforest starts and then goes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's a pretty large expansion of territory. But what we're looking at here, what that also means is like if you kind of went along the base here, like from the coastline, just kind of a segment of it, we get a lot of different environments in a very kind of compact period. And so one of the ways that that can be helpful to us is that we can really easily trace trade networks, right? We can see interaction. And that becomes really important for us when we're looking at the site of Chavin de Wantar, because the specific environment at Chavin de Wantar indicates that trade is important there. We find goods coming from the coast, from the mountains, and from the rainforest. And so one of the reasons, and this kind of coming together of different areas, this coming together of different goods, different images of some of the trade goods that we're seeing too, this helps us to kind of think about this as a pilgrimage center. It doesn't seem like it's an economic center. We don't think we're looking at that, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But what we do see is that there's not a large population that lives there. So this is not a large urban center, this is not a big city, okay? So that's not what we're looking at. The main focus point of this site is a religious complex, and so that's why we think of this as a pilgrimage center where people are coming from throughout the broader region, from the north in contemporary Ecuador, from the east in the rainforest area, from the south in the mountains, and from the coast, coming into this area, which is quite mountainous. Again, we can see by looking at a map that there are historic and ancient trade routes because the mountain passes are accessible year-round. A lot of the high altitude ranges of the Andean mountain range are covered in snow and cannot be crossed the entirety of the year. But there happen to be 2 crossings close to the site of Chavin de Wantar that are available and accessible year-round. So we think that's kind of helping to make this an early, important, and prominent site. You'll also notice, again, here's the site in a map. Here is this kind of river valley that we're looking at, the Masno River, and here's the site that we're looking at specifically. This is the river coming down right in front of it. And this river would have been ideal for trade in many ways, and yet there's no port right there. It seems like the best way of accessing the site, while goods could have been brought down, there are some sections of rapids, so it wouldn't have been the only way in which trade would have occurred in the area. It seems like the site is being accessed from the mountain passes, from the kind of the back of the site, which is up the mountain. Kind of further away, so if we think about our river, our temple complex, and then in this last area, there is a small settlement where we find that there are agricultural spaces and some habitations, but again, not a lot of people are living here. People are passing through here, and it seems like they're bringing things, they're leaving things, and they're taking other things with them. And the main activity that's happening at the site seems to be in this space right here. All right, let's talk about a couple of our methods. How have we studied historically the site of Chavin de Wantar? One way that the site has been kind of analyzed is through the viewpoint of linguistics. And again, there's this idea of using a Quechua word, a Quechua concept of tinki. And this is something, the idea of the convergence of 2 to make 3. And so here are just 2 examples that are pretty common, where rivers meet and flow into a single larger river. Well, how is this idea present at the site of Chavin de Wantar? You'll look, if you see the map, you can see that we have kind of 2 rivers that come together here, and the river becomes much stronger downstream. So it becomes kind of something new, something bigger, following the convergence of 2 to make a larger third. Another common example that's used to describe this term is the idea of when 2 groups battle, and there's a new situation that emerges out of that. Right? So that maybe that brings a new group comes together of the groups mixing together. So this idea of 2 coming together and the third thing coming out of it. So that's kind of the linguistic theoretical understanding of this, of some of the concepts that we start seeing at the site of Shabin Dewantar. And again, it seems like the environment is identifying the site of Shabin as this kind of special place, right? The mountain passes provide access year-round. The river has this convergence of 2 to make 3. And what you'll also notice, if you look at this valley, it's incredibly steep, right? And the site of Shabin Dewantar, you'll notice right here, there's like a little flat platform that just kind of juts out right into that river bend. And so it creates a flat place, which is pretty unusual for the rest of the environment, as you can kind of see the steep slopes that are otherwise along this river valley. So the site, the environment of the site seems to identify it as a unique and special place. So I'm just going to show you, this is a plan. We refer to this as an architectural plan because it's showing us not the actual buildings, but the way in which the buildings are situated in relationship to elements of the landscape. And again, what you'll see is, we often think about approaching these, we see people approaching these from this side, which is a little unusual. Why is that unusual? Because you can't get to it from the river. In order to get to the front of the building, you have to walk from like down the hill and around it. Now, there's a benefit here. Often when I talk about architecture with students, one of the ways I ask students to think about it is how do you get an understanding of the building from the outside, right? And I think we can think about different buildings here on Georgia State. I mean, first of all, how many people, there are several different ways to come into this building, right? How many people come in from the entrance that's right across from Hurt Park? That's usually where I come in from, right? You kind of walk by, you look up, you get a sense like, oh, look how linear this building is. You can see the different floors at the very top. You can see the studios at the top. You kind of have an understanding of how the space is divided up. How many people come in from kind of by the quad side, by the library side over there? Yeah, you don't really get a sense that like this building is kind of at an angle, right? Because we're built around a triangle, right? That's a little strange. How many people weave through Sparks Hall to get to this building? I used to do that, or I sometimes do it if it's raining. Anyone? You have no sense of what the outside of this building looks like then, right? Go out one of the other doors at some point, because if you're weaving in from Sparks Hall, you enter this building on the second floor, right? You don't even really see the entrance or the exit on that first floor. It changes the way you think about it. It makes the building feel more like almost serpentine, right? Like you're in a maze or a labyrinth. So the way in which we still interact with architecture, that really affects how we understand the spaces that we're in. And look at the shape of this building. It's like triangular kind of, right? How does that fit into a very grid-like hallway, right? So you start thinking about the shape of the building in a different way if you notice that the shape of a room is, not square. So these are all elements or kind of phenomenological understandings of the way in which our body interacts with the space around us. Like that, at the site of Shabin, you have to walk kind of around the buildings. Now there are a couple elements of the environment that we haven't talked about, and one of which is that this is an earthquake-prone part of the world. So if you pay attention to the news, or if you use Chrome, which is what our university suggests we use when we use iCollege, I would say about a quarter of the problems that students have with iCollege is because they're using Safari, aka a browser that won't track your every move, when they're using iCollege. So unfortunately, I would probably recommend that you use Chrome when you're using iCollege, but then don't do anything else. That makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist or something, but stay lucky. Totally lost. I got so absorbed in my Google train of thought that I lost my train of thought. Earthquakes. Hold on, I can do this. Tension rolling, earthquakes, Google, Chrome. Who knows? The world's a mystery. All right.
Probably the news.
The news. Yes, thank you. So if you start studying or pulling things up on Google Chrome, it'll start telling you more about about like whatever unit we're in. Like you'll get more news about Peru or news about, usually Peru in the first unit. You'll get more news about Mexico in our second unit. You'll get more news about Africa in our third and fourth units. So, I mean, it's a little creepy, but it can be helpful sometimes like this. But anyway, this is an earthquake-prone part of the world, and you'll see that there will unfortunately be probably an earthquake or some sort of environmental impact during the course of our semester. Because it's an earthquake-prone part of the world, we tend to find that most of the early structures tend to not be very tall, right? Because what happens during earthquakes, the earth moves and buildings like to fall down. Now, a lot of our cultures have actually developed engineering solutions to the environment. And so there are engineering solutions that are built into these 3-story tall buildings that even when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, when they try to use the building techniques of Europe in the 16th century, their buildings fall down more than the ancient buildings, because it turns out that the ancient building techniques were more appropriate for the environment. Who knew, right? So these are 3 stories tall. They're very tall, not just for this time period, but they're still kind of tall for this part of the world. So in order to access the front of these buildings, you have to kind of walk around these buildings that are trying to kind of awe you with their size. They're trying to awe you with how tall they are. And we'll look at some of the sculpture that's on the exterior of these buildings to kind of show ways in which we find kind of other elements of awe on the exteriors. So you have to kind of walk around these structures in order to get to them. Now you'll also notice in looking at this that we have some really fancy naming conventions. Do I have any anthropology majors in here? Oh good, I can speak freely then. We love our archaeologists. They give us a ton of information. They do great work. They're fantastic scientists, but they don't always have helpful naming conventions. So you'll notice on our diagram here that we have the old temple and the new temple. Now in this case, they're actually helping us. The old temple was built first and the new temple was built second. But we will have many examples over the course of this semester where they'll have like, sculpture number 1, sculpture number 2, sculpture number 3. And that number is the order in which they were found, right? So it tells you more about the archaeology of the site than it tells you about the site. So sometimes those numbering systems can be a little bit tricky, but we'll deal with that later. For now, we can trust in our archaeological friends that our old temple is older and our new temple is more recent. The old temple actually used to, there was like a little line that's about right here. After like this was the same size over on this side. It was expanded in the new temple building period. And this was what was known as a U-shaped temple because, thank you archaeologists, it's in the shape of a U, right? It's like a couch almost. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at that space. Again, you would walk around the space into the center of the U. In the center of the U, again, we see a contrast in shape. We shift from these rectilinear U shape to a sunken circular shape. And we see people going down. There are 2 stairs we'll look at. They go down one step, they go up another, and it puts you right at that central staircase that we find as an access point into the interior of the temple. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this building is that it's much more of, it's almost a sculpture in and of itself. And the reason for that is there aren't a lot of rooms in the interior of this building. Rather, it's almost entirely made up of hallways and some small kind of chambers. And that's really kind of interesting too, because there's no evidence of soot on the walls or the ceiling of these interior hallways. Okay, so imagine you're a pilgrim. You've come from hundreds of miles away to go inside a temple. You go inside it, and there are no lights on. There are no windows. There's no skylight. There's no fire inside this temple. So we're not really sure why that is. It's a pretty easy thing to test for, right? It's not like someone scrubbed the walls down either, right? So we just don't find evidence of fire on the inside. Again, some archaeologists and art historians have looked to linguistics as a potential explanation for this. There is a catch-all word that says, "Uhu," that which is hidden is revealed. This idea that maybe the point isn't for human consumption of the interior of the building, that you go in not to see it, but to feel it, to experience it. So the idea and you can see here that these are some of the labyrinthine passageways that have been mapped out by archaeologists at the site. They suggest that people are walking, a select group of people are walking into the building. They are unable to see with light or in any way, and they're almost in this maze. It's almost like they're trying to disorient the people that are coming into the structure. So again, you can see the width is about the width of a single person. So also imagine you're in a single file. If you're with a group of people, you get to the end and you all have to turn around, and then the person who's first becomes last, right? So it's very disorienting. It doesn't give you a sense of what the outside of the building looks like or where you are inside that building, right? We all know her park is right out there. Sure hope at least. Right, her park's out there. The quad's like over there. But in here, if you've been turned around in a dark space and all it's dark except for what you can feel, who knows where you are? You can't tell how close you are to getting out. That would be for me, that would be very anxiety-provoking. There is a slight slope to the floor, so it kind of feels like you're moving down into the ground, even though in order to access the interior, you have to walk up a flight of steps. So again, there are some things that kind of mess with your sense of space, where you are in relationship to this building. The other thing I mentioned is that there were some chambers. Probably the most famous chamber also holds a sculpture that's referred to as El Lanzón. Any Spanish speakers that know what El Lanzón means? It's not like a common word. It'd be like something you might read like in older literature. It's like a lance. You can think about the Lanzón, lance. So almost like a spear or so. And what's interesting, the reason why it's referred to is that, again, that's a Spanish word, that's not a Quechua word, that's probably not at all, we know they weren't speaking Spanish here, they probably weren't speaking Quechua either. That's a Spanish word that's being applied to this sculpture. But what's kind of helpful in thinking about it is that it pierces the ground and the ceiling of the chamber in which it's in, which is also kind of interesting because, again, look at these passageways. The only way to get the sculpture in the room it's in is to build the room around it, right? Have you ever tried to get like a couch out of your room and it gets stuck? And you're like, how in the heck did anyone ever get this in here? Well, in the case of this sculpture, the only way you can get in there is if if there was no room, if the room was built around the sculpture. So that helps us know that that's the focal point, right? That there's some kind of crescendo and access to this that is particularly special. This is a special part of this space. And what's interesting is that, again, it pierces the ground, it pierces the ceiling because it was put in place and then the ceiling was put in around it. And above it, there's another antechamber. So again, the room is kind of open around the sculpture a little bit. I'll show you more pictures, you'll get a sense of it. I know it's a little confusing to hear all about it. You can hear people talking in the room above it if you're below it, okay? And vice versa. So is it some sort of space of communication? Is it an oracle? It seems like there's something happening with these spaces. And this idea of the way that space is organized inside the structure is also important in another way that's kind of a new direction in archaeology. It's called acoustic archaeology, looking at the way in which acoustics operate in kind of ancient spaces. There was a paper that came out just like in 2013 that's looking at the way in which the water moves through the channels, right? So if you think about like flat-topped buildings, if water sits on top of those buildings, it's going to erode over time. It's not going to be great. It's eventually going to like erode through, and there will be places where the ceiling falls in. But there were actually there's like a water removal system at Chavin, and when it rains, water moves through that system, and it sounds like there's like a cat purring in the walls. That's cool. I'm sorry, that's cool. They designed their water removal system to sound like there are animals in the walls. Also, that's terrifying. right? Can you imagine you're in a dark space, you're in the mountains where there are mountain lions, right? There are animals that will eat you in this environment that are felines, okay? And it sounds like they're in the walls when it's raining. That's creepy, right? That would terrify me. So we talked about this as a visual space, but we are missing out, right? If we don't think about the way this space would have sounded for people to be in it. And also, you're in the dark, so you can't see it. Did I see a question or anything? Has everyone got the attendance sheet? Oh, did you come late? That's okay. Send it over if you guys can. Looks like there's a couple people. Thank you guys. All right. So again, remember, sometimes the visual's not the only thing. And this idea of that which is hidden and revealed, again, it seems to privilege this idea of making art for something that's not human in a way, right? Maybe we're not the audience of the art that's being created. And I think that's a very different way of thinking about why people make art than what we're used to perhaps in the United States. The last element, and this is a methodology which we didn't talk about at the beginning of class, but this idea of kind of astronomy or understanding the heavens, especially where the sun rises. The path that we see, the central passageway that we see, it faces the rising sun. So in the morning on 2 days out of the year, the sun rises directly in front. And you can see like where you are in relationship to like the rainy season or the dry season, in relationship to how that sun rises in front of you or to the left or to the right of you, right? And so we do see that there does seem to be a connection between water with acoustics, the sun, maybe time of year, the orientation of this space, because it is an unusual orientation, right? You have to walk around it to get to the front. Maybe it's charting the sun, movements of the sun as part of the reason why it is oriented in this specific way. All right, so just to kind of give us a little bit of a clearer picture too, we do use some ethnographic analogy to help us understand parts of the site of Shebeen Dewantar, particularly the sculpture El Lanzon. So for example, we're going to look at both ethnographic analogy as well as ethnographic sources. So ethnographic analogy, again, is using what we know about one culture, the Inca, in this instance, to understand what we don't know about the site of Shebeen Dewantar. So this comes from a manuscript that was made in the 17th century. And what I want us to pay attention to here is the way in which we have a kind of a particular shape of something called an Andean foot plow. And that's something that was used to, again, plant products, plant agricultural products. In Quechua, it's called a taque. You can see that right here. We know that taques often have ritual significance because we find examples of them all the way from Shebeen all the way up until the 15th century with production by the Inca. So this is an example of an Inca ceramic object. It's about this big, so you could not have used it as an actual planting object. Also, it's made of ceramic. And it's kind of celebrating the kind of entire life cycle of maize or corn. So we see there is a maize cob at the top. This is hollow, which a takia normally would be made of wood, and it wouldn't be. But this is a vessel that would have held maize beer, aswa. And we know that they're pouring this fermented corn beverage through the top of this ceramic vessel. If I can find it. Through the top of this ceramic vessel, it's open, it's hollow. And then it pours through and it comes out. One of the reasons we know this is because when it was donated to Emery's museum, it was broken. And this little piece right here, at the end, this little part right here, which you would normally use, you can see it's like a cross from the man in Guamangoma, right? That little hook right there. That was broken, and there was this like crud in the bottom of it. And that is like, that crud is dried up corn beer from the 15th century, which is kind of cool. And so we tested that, and we know that it's even a specific kind of corn that was used to make the aswa. In parts of the Andes, they have maize corns that are black, like the color. So we have in the United States, we usually have yellow and white corn. Sometimes you might see like in a maize, or like decorative corn in the United States, you might find like the dark black corn. You can find whole cobs of that in the Andes, and so we know that that's the specific kind of corn that was being made. Is that a question?
Yes. So I'm confused. So they made the corn beer ceramic device after the foot plow?
something that is used as a ritual object. So the takya, there's a little bit of catch along this one, I apologize. The takya, that's what an Andean foot plow is. Takcha, don't worry about it. It just means a ritual watering vessel or a ritual fluid vessel. It's any basically ceramic, you can have a fluid flowing through it. So it could be water, it could be aswa, it could be anything that's liquid. Here it's like a miniature one that seems to be suggesting like the importance of agriculture. And we see the shape of El Lanzon is in the same shape. So there seems to be a history of incorporating this shape. Imagine, if you will, like the shape of a Christmas tree, right? That's something that we find kind of like different references to. You might find it in different media. You might find sculptures. You might find drawings. You might find photographs. You might find T-shirts. You might find whatever's, right? You might find it in metal or in wood. And so that's an image that kind of clues you into maybe like Christmas or December or whatever, okay? Similarly, we see here this shape of the flip plow, suggesting the importance of agriculture and rituals that link back to the importance of agriculture. What we see happening in this drawing is not just giving us, a vocabulary lesson, it's also describing a time period where there are agricultural rituals in order to kind of protect the agricultural products that are being put into the ground at the time. And again, remember, El Lanzon, our sculpture here at Chavin, it penetrates the ground and the ceiling, right? It goes into the ground. The tip of it is hidden in the ground. And so that's something that, again, seems to relate back to this idea of a foot plow, a plow, something about agriculture, something about fertility and fecundity, and the abundance that can come from it. Now, again, we've talked a little bit about the way in which the temple is not a particularly vibrant in terms of bright sight. It's hard to see inside. And even if you go in with contemporary lighting, it's really hard to look at this, which is the actual sculpture itself, and see this on the left. This is what we call a rollout. And this is, this allows us to see the image on a singular plane rather than wrapped around a three-dimensional object onto multiple planes. Does that make sense? So we're going to get to see it in an easier form than anyone who saw it. And remember, they're looking at it in the dark. Okay? So if you're like, it's kind of hard to see what you're talking about, at least I'm letting you look at it in the light. You'll notice that these are incised lines. So you might be able to feel different parts of it. I don't know how people interacted, if people were this isn't a museum historically. Now it is, you can't go and touch it. But were people touching it to get a sense of it? Hard to say. What I can tell you is we're going to look at a series of sculptures on the exterior that would have helped people kind of know that it was in there in a way. So here we go, just to get a sense. I'm showing you, I think I showed you this to you guys on Monday, so you can get a sense of scale, right? It's pretty large. It's 15 feet tall. I'm never going to ask you that, but just so that you get a sense of scale, it's a massive thing. And you can also see that flat space that then goes up and penetrates the ceiling. You can kind of see up above. Obviously now there are lights in there so that people can see it more easily, but we can talk about what it means to be authentic, but I don't think a lot of tourists would go if they were like, go into the dark room and then don't see the thing you drove all the way here to see. So you have to bet a little. I actually, and I don't know if it's bad. Do you guys know who Barney is, the purple dinosaur? Okay. I had a faculty member at Tulane who was like, I always think of him as the Barney god. So I don't know if that's going to help you, or that always made me groan. But maybe he does. I don't. Is that does that help you? I don't know. It's not a dinosaur, I'll say that much. But what we do see a figure though, right? So you can see that there's a figure. One of the things I'll say, and again, you don't need to do it in class. I don't want anyone to stand up right now and do this. If you are reading your materials in the library or studying in the library, you don't need to get up and do this, but I often encourage you to get in the position of the figures that we see in sculptures, because you kind of start understanding that people, first of all, that's really hard to do, but that's what the feet are doing, right? And then he has the arms are like this, right? When I stand like this, And it's on a sculpture that goes through the ceiling and goes through the floor, right? So you kind of start like getting a sense for a little bit of what, I also feel like I'm like walking like an Egyptian now, but you get a sense for maybe like how does it feel to be in that posture? And that's also a phenomenological way of understanding figures in a work of art. You'll also notice it's like, oh, when I look at the feet and the hands to see how they're positioned, someone needs to cut their fingernails, right? They're like claws. Those aren't human hands, and those are not human feet, okay? At least it starts giving us that idea, because you can't walk with toenails that long. So this starts giving us maybe the sense that, okay, so maybe this isn't a human, or maybe this is only partially human. If we look again at the body seems to be pretty upright, right? The legs, the torso, the arms, those seem pretty human, but the face does not necessarily seem human, right? What about the face is not human? Yeah.
Looks like it has like tusks.
Yeah, they almost look like tusks or really big teeth, right? Either way, probably, like most people don't have those. Any other ways? How else is this not human? Yeah.
Like front facing nostrils, like they don't go down.
Yes, exactly. It's like they're almost like crocodilian, maybe. Like there's like a snout, and they're like flared up, right? So almost maybe like, so we can almost start seeing maybe some animals that might have this, right? Like maybe crocodilian. For the teeth, maybe feline, something, or other things. Do I see a hand over here? Yeah.
Because they have long ears, like normals.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So here's where we get some of my good stereotypes. Because it's helpful to have them sometimes. All right, I don't mean stereotypes about people and culture. I mean things that can help you identify what you're looking at. In the Andes, in general, so I don't like make this for everyone in the Andes. The larger the ear spools, or you guys are gonna have to help me here, gauges. Is that what we're calling them now? Okay, gauges. The bigger the gauges, the more important the person, right? And there's also a status and hierarchy of material. So like someone with wood gauges, like if they're big, you know, like you're doing okay, you came from nothing, but you've raised up. If you're wearing gold or silver, you probably came from an elite family and you've also acquired some power for yourself. So there's a little bit of a status associated with different materials, but it's kind of hard to tell if we're looking at wood or metal or gold. In general, bigger is better. Yeah.
What is under the mouth? Like
So here's my question. I know which mouth do you mean?
are there two then?
Kinda. How many noses do people see?
Like
3.
See, don't you love all the different answers? Right? So, if we count this as the mouth, I didn't mean that. Yeah?
Yeah.
So this almost looks like the chin, but this can almost also function like a mouth, kind of. And here's where it starts. I mean, so then it's like, is this the nose? Is that the nose? Is that the nose? And then you look at the top, and what do you notice about the eyebrows?
They're long.
They are long, first of all. Someone needs a trim. What else? Yeah, they have like 4 really thick eyes. Can you see what's on them? They're snake heads. I know that. I'm always like, if your roommate has any of these characteristics, you might want to like send an email and try to get a new one, right? They have snake eyebrows, which again, that's not a real thing, right? Some of these elements we can look at it and go, oh, okay, like that looks like a nose. That's like a thing, right? Most things don't have snake eyebrows, okay? We call these visual substitutions. What's kind of interesting about this, we also see like images hidden within images, right? So if this is what's fun about Chabin art, right? If these are the eyes, right? Those are the eyes. That's like a really amazingly long eyelash with a snake head. You see it? Snake head, eyelash. Here's our nose. Here's our mouth with our tusks. And is this a necklace? A tattoo? I don't really know. I have to be honest with you. But you can also like, look, this is the nose on these eyes, right there. Because you'll notice that they're in the same shape as the eyeballs, right? We refer to these as pendant irises. The irises are at like the top typically, and so you can start to find them, you know, right here, right here, right here, right here, right here. And if you look up top, you'll notice another series of heads, right? You see the eye, the curled nose, right? That curled up nose snout, and then the teeth. If I can, what my cursor is here. And then the teeth. You guys see that face? Can you see the upside down face too? Right? So each one of these has eye, nose, teeth, eyes, nose, teeth, right? And it functions in like a little unit where they're in relationship to each other. Now, behind all of this, and remember guys, this is in a dark room, incised on a three-dimensional object where you only can see part of this at any one time. This is not meant to be seen as easily as we're seeing it, right? So you can thank me later. There's a vine that's twisting around the back of it. This becomes really important. Context matters, archaeology matters. I'll get your point in a second. Archaeology matters. This vine is probably, I'm never gonna ask you this. If you're curious, you can let me know. It's called Banisterius kaapi. And Banisterius kaapi is a vine that produces seeds. They're called vilca seeds. And if you crush them up and ingest them, you can either dilute them in a liquid, often like a fermented corn beverage or fermented other vegetable beverage. Or you can crush them up into powder and sniff them up your nose. Not that I'm condoning or suggesting that you do this, but you will see things that other people do not, okay? And so maybe my long hair starts to look like snakes to you if you've done this, right? Maybe my bushy eyebrows start to look like snakes to you if you have consumed this. Maybe my long fingernails morph into these claw-like hands and toes, and I start looking like something altogether different, okay? Question?
Yes, you mentioned earlier that the sculpture in the room that it's in is piercing both the ceiling and the floor, and that its hands are pointing up and down. What do you think that symbolizes?
I mean, I think on the one hand, it makes you maybe think about the ceiling and the floor, like it maybe brings attention to the fact that it pierces both of those. You know, it seems like we're looking at something, you know, there would be 2 days a year where sun would come in and you could see this, okay? So 363 days of the year, you can't see this. There are 2 days when the sun rises, you can see this sculpture with light, natural light. And, you know, is it talking about the sky and the ground? Is it talking about, you know, the sun and agriculture and their connection to it? Is this something that unites it because it unites the floor and the ceiling? Something along those lines seems to be most possible. What we also find in that passageway are a series, and historically, I actually had a friend write a master's thesis on mirrors found at Shameen. And the idea historically was that they were using it to, I'll get your question in a second, to magnify the light, right? Like if you have a mirror and light, like everyone knows, like you can like kill ants with that, right? But it also makes light brighter, right? Because it's gonna reflect and hit more surfaces. But it's also like a pretty flat, smooth tray, and it's really good for crushing up seeds and then snuffing them off your nose. So it's probably snuff trays, not mirrors. But you know, historically, people didn't like to think about mind-altering substances the way in which contemporary cultures do. So it kind of went right over their heads.
Do you think the fact that we're seeing it flat on is what's giving us so many interpretations?
Yes.
Because I feel like in
There were, I mean,
the
also,
actual,
first of all, that outfit is probably cool now, right? Historically, when I taught this class, everyone's like, where did you get that slide? And now people are like, I like the sunglasses. Anyway, sorry, that was not your point.
because I feel like in this,
On the
like,
right?
where you actually see the sculpture, it looks more like the first set of eyes that you were talking about are the eyes, and like I guess in the recreation, the strap at the bottom
Is more
goes
here.
all the way
Yeah.
across, but there it looks like a necklace.
So I love that observation. So are you suggesting that the reconstruction is not 100% accurate? Let's talk pearls, right? Yeah, that's the problem with using reconstruction. Like it does shift it from its original context to a way that sometimes you're like, that's not accurate. It doesn't look like that. It's helpful though,
Yeah.
right? Because you're like, oh, I see the face kind of better. I see all these different elements a little better. You have to use them together in my mind, right? So yeah, they're not always accurate. They're just like the most publishable. I could sit here and talk about this image like all day. What I want us to kind of get a sense of is if that image is so hard for us to read, how do people know how to read it? And the answer is, on the exterior of the building, there are examples of this kind of system, right? Where we see kind of ways in which people become familiar with seeing the images within the image, the replication of eyes, the kind of animal qualities mixing with the human qualities, okay? So we start seeing that on the exterior. So we're gonna look at something called the sunken circular courtyard. I pointed it out when I said we walked around. You go down steps, you're in this circular courtyard, and then you go up another steps, and you're right at the base of stairs that go into the hall, into the building that has all the maze-like passages. So we're gonna start there. In this sunken circular courtyard, this is just a drawing, just a model. If you move to the left, if you go down and turn to the left, you walk in line, so all the figures are pointing to the left, they're oriented to the left. If you turn to the right, all the figures are pointed to the right. But that might make a little bit more sense when I show you what the figure is. Again, this is just a line drawing because there are multiple of these images, and a lot of them are in kind of disrepair. But what we start seeing on the exterior is an image that's not unlike what we see on El Lenzon, right? On our interior image. What kind of feet, what do we notice about the feet? Probably not human. Could be avian, right? Like a bird of prey. Look at the hands also. Here we don't even have like 5 digits, right? So it really reminds you of like kind of moving away from the human experience. Wow, look at the mouth. Okay, that's not a human mouth, right? Maybe a feline mouth, right? Seems a little bit more likely. Again, our nose seems to be like the nostrils are flared up. So is this like related to crocodilian species? Again, the pendants are up. I can't remember who pointed out the ear. We see this as kind of like a typical ear shape here. But here you really get a sense of hair turning into snakes, right? That's a lot easier to see here. Yeah, question?
I can't tell. It's like I can see like the circular nose, but above it, it looks like a different type of nose almost. But then it looks like that's also
Like the
where
mouth?
lips go.
Yeah, it's like the lips are kind of coming and starting up here. It's like it doesn't quite make complete sense in our minds, I think. You know, you're right, you're absolutely right. The other thing you'll notice is that our figure's wearing what we refer to as a back flap, and that doesn't mean anything to me in particular. What I think a description of a back flap would be like did anyone ever see someone on Halloween wear like fairy wings or butterfly wings or things like that? It seems to be a costume element that has these images on it. But look at what's on these images. Oh look, it's our mouth, the tooth, and the nose, and an eye, and then a curl of like the eyelash. Is this the ear or hair? It's not totally clear. Kind of squint your eyes and you can see it. If you look up here, you can see that eye again though, right? There's the eye with the pendant iris. Here it looks like that's the nose. Right, so you can see that there are ways of, you start to see and learn the image, and then it gets played with, and morphed, and played with, or minimized, or given more detail, and certain parts are more obvious or clearer than others. There are two, you'll notice here that there are 2 registers, right? We have a row of figures that are walking, and then there's a row of felines that are at the bottom. This row of felines at the bottom, it's like, again, it's this idea, this kind of style of sculpture to the nth degree, right? So it starts off kind of looking broadly like a feline, like a cat, right? So head, body, legs, tail, feet. Who has a cat? Your cat feet look like this? Oh my God, I hope not. They look like eagle feet or something, right? But they've got these like claws and talons like birds of prey. So it's not just human becoming animal. Right? It's kind of mixing everything up. It's felines and avians, right? Birds and cats. You can see the face. Our face looks a lot like the face we've been looking at. We have the pendant iris, the nose, the teeth where the teeth come out, the mouth where the teeth come outside the lips, like a feline does. You guys ever see your cat, for people with cats, have you ever seen like their lips get like a tooth stuck outside it and they look all stupid and like, that's what's happening kind of permanently. What about our whiskers here? We got our snake heads, right? The whiskers become snake heads. And you can see, you know, again, you don't have to own a cat to do well. Are we out of time? No, okay. Do you ever have your cat get like excited or scared during like a thunderstorm and like all the hair stands on end? Look at the hair standing on end. They're little snake heads, aren't they cool? So we get this kind kind of expanding of the iconography, the expansion of the ways in which we see these ideas being played with and put into this visual system. You'll also notice our spots on the feline have turned into eyeballs, right? So they're like figure eights with eyes in them, but they're also faces. Does anyone see a face that's not on the actual face? Where? Everywhere. Yeah, that's probably a fair point, right? You see the eye right here, nose, you see the mouth, and the tongue is coming out, and it's like, the tail is like a tongue. Do you guys see that? Here, let me point it out. Again, they're everywhere, right? Like, take your pick of which one you're gonna look at, right? So here we have our eye, nose, mouth, teeth. See all the little teeth? And there's the tongue, right? But they're everywhere. Look, eye, mouth, right? Yeah, right? Eye, nose, mouth, like our teeth, you know, and the tongue coming out. They're like everywhere. Oh, look, there's a little face right here. Eyes, nose, mouth. Eye, nose, mouth, and that's within the nose. Yeah, well, that's that tongue coming out, right? Well, and you know what? I'll say this. We will talk about this kind of idea of an entheogen. The slide is like you prepped me. An entheogen is a substance that brings, or it's something that brings one closer to the divine. Has anyone ever fasted for a religious holiday? The reason you do that is because the idea is that it brings you closer to the divine, right? Sometimes what we're looking at here is a substance as an entheogen, right? Vilca seed. Our shamans are holding San Pedro's cactus. That's what we commonly call a cactus. Who's San Pedro in Catholicism? St. Peter. And what is St. Peter known for? What's his attribute? Does anyone know what that is? And what's St. Peter's attribute? He holds the keys to heaven, right? The idea is if you drink a brew of, and I'm not condoning or suggesting that you do this weekend on Labor Day weekend, but the idea is that if you ingest products related to San Pedro's cactus, that heaven, the gates of heaven will be open to your mind, right? You'll see things that other people aren't seeing, okay? That's often referred to as a hallucinogen, psychotropics, there's all sorts of different kinds of names. In this class, we're going to use the term entheogen, because the idea is that this is not like, hey man, let's have some fun on the weekend. This is, and these are also substances that make people vomit. Your body tries to rid yourself of them. And so there are certain, and we can talk more about this later, but this idea that an entheogen brings someone closer to the divine, it's not for recreational drug use, okay? So I'm not suggesting you do this. But if you are ingesting San Pedro's cactus, spots might become faces, right? Hands might become claws, different kinds. These are experiences that are kind of recounted as consistent behavior with people who ingest San Pedro cactus. Also, we know Vilca seeds, I mentioned this idea of mirrors in the passageway. These are tenon heads that are on the exterior. There's only one that's extant, that's actually like in the wall. They kind of like float out, moving like gargoyles over people when they walk by. Here are the ones that have been found on the ground around, and you'll notice that they all have ruptured nasal membranes, which means they are depicting people that have ingested through their nose a powdery substance, probably Vilca seeds. And this idea, if you've probably heard, the idea that when people consume a mind-altering substance, they might feel like they're flying. So it's probably not surprising that we're seeing images of people turning into birds, right? They're getting a different perspective on the world from a bird's eye view, perhaps. They're looking down on the entirety of humanity, or the entirety of a place. So again, I try to kind of move away from these terms that are laden with recreational drug use. I'll try to kind of make sure that we all understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about entheogens. I'm not trying to condone them. I'm going to be totally honest with you. I have not done Vilca, I have not snorted Vilca seeds. I've not drank San Pedro cactus brew, things like that. So I can't tell you experientially, but I have been around people who have been lot of like, I can tell you what we think it means, but there's not usually one definition. So it's about being able to identify what you're seeing, right? So like a question might say, these images show a combination of human and, and it might then list like birds, dogs, dinosaurs, camels. Okay, and the answer would be both. Okay, so just to know what you're looking at, right? And that might be one level of question. There might be another level of question that says, how does this image show us that entheogens were being, consumed at the site of Shibata Wanta? And then and then there's the other. So, and that would be another level, another way of thinking about it. So, how does this object inform us about the culture? Does that answer your question? There is a free test in iCollege. You can take it as often as you want. If you take it 10 times, I need to open it up again for you. I'm happy to do that. But it'll give you a sense of the kind of questions that I'll ask. Okay, and that can be helpful. It does